Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 24, Lesson 4, The War at Home. Actually, I might have put this lesson before the one we just did about the war, and because, we left off with the war being, ending. So this is about what the war was like for us as we were ramp up to go in and then during the war. So try to think of this with what we just talked about before instead of after. Okay. All right. So what was it like for the US to get ready for the war? First of all, that idea of getting ready for the war is called mobilization. And you have to gather up all your troops and all the resources and money and things for the war effort. So that is what mobilization is. And one of the things that was key for getting this ramp up going is that we needed to make sure the factories could produce everything. And one of the concerns that they had was that there were a lot of strikes and things. People, I'm sure you remember in your industrialization history in the past that factories, the workers have been fighting trying to get less than 12-hour days and fair pay and safer working conditions. So the National Labor Board, National War Labor Board, is a government organization that is going to try to make sure that things go smoothly between the workers and the management to make sure there's not strikes or work stoppages. Okay. And the workers will agree to this if they can get some of their demands met. So they do agree to an 8-hour workday, which is much better than the 12 hours. Also, a lot of women are going to end up being into the workforce and they are wanting to have equal pay that the men were getting. And also, it's okay to form unions. This was a big deal. Unions are protecting the workers' rights, right, by working together as a group. And they were very unpopular. The management and the richer people, right, did not like unions because they um, have strikes and things to try to help the worker, but it's bad for the bottom line of the company, right? So, anyway, we agreed to these things to make sure that the war effort could go on and that there would not be any strikes. All right, the other thing is, how is the government going to pay for the war? Well, of course, they're going to raise taxes. That is one way you can always get money if you're a government is through taxing. But the other thing is that they sold war bonds. Now, this is not the first time. In other previous wars, we've also sold war bonds. Um, if you don't remember, bonds are an idea where someone buys a bond with the idea that they will eventually, at the end of the term of the bond, will be paid back by interest, or in fact, this one they paid them not just at the end, as they were waiting. And so you end up getting your money back plus interest. Okay, so it's like an investment. But in the meantime, the government is actually like borrowing your money so that they can use it right away for the war effort. Okay. And so you'll see by this propaganda poster that was put out that they're trying to appeal to the people's, patriotism and maybe even fear. You can see they're making the Germans look right like evil, and that you can do your part as a patriotic citizen. Notice they call them liberty bonds, not just war bonds. And you can do your part if you, lend us the money by buying war bonds. So you notice propaganda is used widely, not just by the U.S., by all of the countries, trying to get their people to be in favor of the war and do what they need for a successful war effort. Okay, um, so how do they deal with some of the problems? So first of all, one of the problems they have is they need a lot of workers for the factories. The men, a lot of them have gone off to war, right? So there is a shortage. And so who is going to fill these jobs? Well, the other problem they're having is there's less immigrants, right? Previously, immigrants were a large portion of the people that were working in the factories because they could work for lower pay because they were more desperate, right? Well, now the European immigration is way down, right? Because there's a war going on and we're not allowing a lot of people into the country. So they have women are going to be encouraged to come work in the factories, which is not to say women have never worked in the factories. Some have, depending on certain industries, but now these are even, manly jobs, right? And they need the women to come do this hard work on behalf. So they are encouraged, and again, propaganda is used to encourage them. Okay, so women fill it a lot. Also, we see some African Americans filling the jobs. You may remember the Great Migration after the Civil War, right? And when there were so many African Americans who were no longer slaves and needed jobs, and they knew only agricultural work, right? But when jobs are opening up more in the cities in the South and factories, large groups of African Americans started moving from the South up to the North. So that's called the Great Migration. And so African Americans filled some of the jobs. And we do have some Mexican migration across the border to also fill some of these jobs. All right, the other problem is supplying all of the soldiers in the war effort. So one issue was food. How do we feed all these soldiers? So they made something called the Food Administration, and this is Herbert Hoover. He was put in charge of that, and he will later become a president. Herbert Hoover used propaganda and tried to influence the farmers to raise more crops and make sure it's food crops, right? Not other cash crops. And also to encourage people at home to eat less. So they want them to voluntarily give up eating some things or eat less of it. It's called rationing, when you limit how much you use of something. And you can see propaganda used widely. Like, look at this propaganda poster. Making, you can do your part at home to help defeat the Kaiser, right? The German emperor and his U-boats, right? We talked about the submarines. And you can help us by eating less wheat, which may seem kind of silly, but, right, if you don't eat the wheat, then they can use it to make food for the soldiers, right? So again, you can feel like you're doing your part at home. If I give it up eating it here, my husband or son will, get to have it when he's off at war, right? So propaganda is used widely. The War Industries Board is another government agency. It is helping the factories shift what they're producing to war-related things. So, for instance, if you were a clothing manufacturer, maybe now you are going to stop making what you were and start making all, soldiers' uniforms. This happened recently here in the United States, where factories were asked to switch to making PPE for the COVID outbreak, right? And they also set prices on some key goods that they wanted to make sure that, that there wasn't inflation, and, because some things are going to be in lower supply. All right, the fuel administration. Another problem that we're having at this point, the major fuel sources or energy sources are coal and oil at this point. And so they need the coal and oil for the soldiers, right, for the war effort. So one of the things they tried to do was to encourage people to use less, but also they put in place daylight savings time, which seems like a normal thing to us now. But the idea was, if we change the clocks, right, then you get to use more of the natural daylight. If you get up earlier, right, you are getting all the days of the time of daylight, and you don't need to have the lights on, right? So they're trying to conserve that energy. And so they used a combination of propaganda and, trying to get people to conserve what they use. With this new idea of daylight saving time, they even had something called Heatless Mondays, right? So if you're patriotic, you won't use the heat on Monday and you'll just bundle up, and, right, people did it because they wanted to, help out, maybe like, again, like their husband, or if I don't use the heat today, even if I'm kind of cold, right, I can imagine my husband having to go without it, so I'll go without it to help him, kind of thing. Okay. All right, so we also want to make sure that there was good public support in general for the war effort. So the big job was the Committee on Public Information, led by someone named George Creel, and his job was to make the propaganda and make people feel like the war was positive. It was a battle for democracy and freedom. So they hired a bunch of writers and artists and actors and famous people, and they gave speeches. They wrote in the newspaper. They had these posters and pamphlets and articles everywhere trying to make people feel like the war effort was a positive thing. So George Creel was the leader of that. And you can see, right, this I want you for the U.S. Army, and that Uncle Sam became an icon after this, representing the United States, right? And so that's still used today. Okay. All right, so public opinion was very important. Now, not everyone was in favor of the war. There was some opposition. So, first of all, one of the things is going to be if you are like, let's say you're a German immigrant. Well, obviously, you might have mixed feelings about the war, right? And you might have family members in Germany, and you feel like conflicted, right? Also, there are people who are opposed politically to the war. One group was called the Socialists. So socialists believe that the people, the workers, should own basic industries or factories, not private industry. So they're not wrong. They think that the war would help those factory owners become even richer, which did happen. So what happens is if those factories are getting these government contracts to make war materials, actually a lot of them did get even wealthier. And what socialists want is they think that factories and things should be owned as a group by all the workers, and that they would kind of each get a share. And so your hard work would, you know, be given directly back to you, and you would be motivated to work hard and do well because it eventually comes right back to you, right? So that's the belief that socialists have, and there were a good number of socialists. There even were some who ran for office, and there still are today. Okay. All right. Of course, there's also another group of people who are against war, and that is a pacifist. Anyone who thinks that any kind of violence is not okay, you should, work out your problems without violence. So pacifists, of course, are going to be against it. So as I said before, it was really important that the public be in favor of the war effort. And so it was the Committee on Public Information's job, which I talked about previously, that they were supposed to make sure that the public is in favor of it. And so what they would do is they made it seem like if you spoke out against the war, that you must not be a good U.S. citizen. They question your patriotism. They implied that maybe anyone who spoke out is actually working for our enemy. And unfortunately, there were a lot of cases where people who were maybe if you're German and you have an accent, or even if you're not German but you have an accent, you are thought of as suspicious. Maybe you're spying, maybe you're working for the enemy. And so unfortunately that did happen. And there was a bunch of laws that were passed. If you were to speak out against the law, that's called dissent, when you disagree or oppose, and they passed laws. So, for example, the Espionage Act of 1917 made it illegal if you were caught spying or aiding the enemy in some way, giving some information, even interfering with army recruiting. So let's say you have spoke out and had a rally saying you shouldn't, listen to the draft and you shouldn't go sign up to fight and everything. Well, you could be arrested and put in prison or fined because you are working against the cause of the war effort. Okay. And this did happen. Also, the Sabotage Act is if you were caught doing anything like destroying war supplies or any kind of government property, you could be, again, fined or put in prison. Usually the fines for these things were up to $10,000, or the imprisonment could be for not more than 20 years, or could get both of those. So sedition also was another law that was passed, Sedition Act, that it was a crime to say, print, or write any criticism of the government or the war effort. So again, if you spoke out and said that you did not think the war was a good thing or that the government was doing a good job, you could be put in prison or fined. And this did happen. Thousands of people are convicted. They did challenge some of them and even went up to the Supreme Court, right? Because obviously, as you can remember, we talked about the Bill of Rights. Number one was the freedom of speech, right? And so you can see that this seems to be against the freedom of speech. Interestingly enough, the Supreme Court upheld the law, meaning that it said it's okay in this time of war that if you are hurting, it's more damaging to hurt the war effort. So it was okay, which does seem a little surprising, doesn't it? That your right to speak is, only to a limited extent, at least with the Supreme Court at that point in history. Okay, I have an end puzzle about these so that you can learn more about them.